Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jéssica Moreira. I'm a co-founder of Nós, Mulher da Periferia, We Women from the Outskirts, and I have the pleasure to mediate this roundtable about gender violence against journalists, carried out by Abraji with the support of UNESCO. And to think about it and to talk about it in this important day, which is March 8th, the International Women's Day, we'll have here other participants and women that uh, consider this issue from different perspectives. So it's important to think that we, even during a pandemic, during a health crisis, a sanitary, journalism was crucial. But sometimes women journalists were made invisible and they suffered a lot of violence and gender violence. So to start, I would like to call Marlova Noleto. She's a director and representative of UNESCO in Brazil. She's a master of social sciences from the Rio Grande do Sul University, and she wrote about gender and journalism, and she studied in the Institute of Journalism in New York. And she's also from the Sweden Federation of Social Studies and study poverty, educational programs, and social responsibility. So welcome, Marlova, to this roundtable, and you have the floor. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to congratulate my friends on this roundtable. They are all women on the Women International Day, which is a symbolical day to launch this report produced by Abraji, supported by the Global Fund for the Defense of Media of UNESCO. We believe that in days like today, more than in others, we have to use our voices. We have to use our voices to speak out on everything that make us restless and make us worried, and the issue of violence against journalists, and in particular against women journalists, has been a subject of constant work by UNESCO. Unfortunately, data that we will have today and that we will present to you, they follow a trend, a global trend, which can be checked on surveys in all statistics that UNESCO possess, following acts of violence against journalists. As you may be aware, the general director of UNESCO is also a woman, and she has a report to follow and of violence against women journalists. And she asked countries to send information about violent acts and deaths, because unfortunately we have also deaths within journalists, and these cases are caused by or associated with journalism. And those journalists suffer acts of violence. And the report that we launched today in partnership with Abraji brings a structure of violence against women and the attacks and the gender attacks in Brazil. And it brings data, monitoring data that were collected in 2021, showing that 119 attacks against women were registered in that year, and these attacks involve media professionals. It means that we had one attack each 3 days in Brazil, according to Abraji data in this report. In the end of 2020, so therefore during the pandemic, and I would like to highlight that the pandemic brought greater issues than those we were already facing. First, the pandemic made our inequalities even larger, and those the most vulnerable among us were they're more affected. As for education, we have the largest interruption of educational services. So as we are today, with the pandemic decreasing its rate, we'll have a scenario of war in Europe. So not even during the World War I, World War II, the interruption of education was so large as we have right now due to the pandemic. And we know that those that are the most vulnerable, that they are uh, in the society and the poorer among all of us are those who have had the most difficulty to found online classes, either for absence of connective or absence of proper material or proper education. We carried out a survey about education in the favelas in Brazil, and the scenario was absolutely terrible. And why am I bringing inequality during the pandemic to this discussion? Because we live in a world that is everything is connected, and women, especially women in the outskirts and in the vulnerable areas, they are those who are the breadwinners of families. And I want to congratulate them for today, because they have a lot of difficulties. They live through challenges every day. They live an unprecedented days during the pandemic, and they could provide for their family. They could follow their kids in their classes, sometimes using only one smartphone for four children. So things that we have in our houses that we take for granted, we are all connected here, and we don't see the dimension of it. So by the end of 2020, UNESCO launched this world survey about violence, online violence against women journalists. And it was carried out in partnership with the International Center of Women Journalists. And it was called Online Violence Against Journalists. And this study was answered by 900 showed very alarming data. According to them, 63% of women that were surveyed told that they had online violence. And this data shows us that online attacks against women journalists increased exponentially in context with the pandemic, the hidden pandemic of violence against women. So the pandemic is also penetrating the offline event. So the need to tackle the problem is even higher. So we have to understand the different types of threats that women journalists are facing. It's essential to develop measures to protect and to correct attacks. So the gender dimension must be contemplated in the answer to deploy mechanisms to prevent and protect against attacks against journalists. So beyond gender, we also have to consider other intersections such as race, religion, age, sexual orientation. We must not forget that Brazil also had a lot of episodes of prejudices, bias, a very conservative, a strong conservative wave. And so when we consider all these intersections, we must take this into account. So the data of the Abraji report show the advance, the Abraji's activities in improving security, especially in research, advocacy, and safety. So we train women journalists, we train uh, media managers, and also we train people from the legal system, such as judges, prosecutors, in human rights, access to information, and also journalist security. Advocacy, it's about awareness and to promote campaigns so all that can understand that those dates, such as today, have a symbolism. May 3rd, which is the freedom of the press, September 28th is International Day of Access to Information. And I would like to remind you that we live, during the pandemic, we lived a crisis of misinformation and disinformation. And they are generally mentioned as fake news. And in this scenario, journalism and free press have a central role, and they have to be defended, and they have to be that a free media, a plural media, it's a pillar of a democratic society. So it's a collective obligation to help to defend each and every journalist today, especially today, focus on women journalists. So we have to remind that gender violence is present on the profession of journalists, and the report that we launched today with Abraji is even more important because in 2022, we will celebrate 10 years of our action plan of the United Nations on journalist security and the issue of impunity, which was voted on the UN resolution, supported more than 75 countries. Brazil is one of them. And this plan support different agencies, funds, and programs to work with countries that are member of the UN for a free and safe environment for journalists and media professionals in conflict situations and also in non-conflictual situations in order to enhance, to improve all over the world. So when we are back to a scenario in which a war haunts us and violence is part of our daily lives in a lot of countries, including Brazil, we have to always to remember the values that we defend and how we do it as an organization. So UNESCO believes in a media that is independent, plural, and we have to strengthen the mechanisms that ascertain the safety of journalists while they work. As our director mentioned, access to information, trust to reliable information and an open debate promoted by a free and independent media is fundamental for a free future and a peaceful future and a fairer world, which is one that we all desire. So UNESCO would like to congratulate Abraji and journalists, women journalists present here, and to reinforce its commitment to support freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and safety of journalists to all. Thank you. Thank you, Marlova. For those who are here, Marlova is the director of UNESCO Brazil, and she presented us what we are, what we present you in this report about gender violence against women journalists. So it's such an important day, and we are reflecting. I think we have a connection issue. There's a storm here in São Paulo, so. And we are reflecting, I think. So we now can give the floor to Verônica. Hi, Verônica. So we have a storm here in São Paulo, so maybe she lost her connection. So Verônica. So now Verônica will have the floor. And and Jessica will be back sooner. Hi, thank you. Thank you. No, we'll wait for Jessica to come back. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Verônica Toste. I'm the professor of the Federal University Fluminense in Rio de Janeiro, and I was a consultant on this research about violence against women and women journalists and gender violence. I have a presentation to show you because we had a lot of data to present. So I think it's easier for you so you can see. But before, I would like to congratulate and salute all women, especially women journalists that work every day to bring information and with transparency to check the work of governments, to bring the truth, and to work in favor of democracy, to promote democracy. So I would like to congratulate all women journalists for today. So now, so I'd like to confirm, can you, okay, can you see my presentation? I will control so we can have a debate later. So the monitoring carried out by Abraji looks at the scenario of violence against journalists, especially women journalists. As was very well explained by Marlova, we know that this trend is on the rise, and it's a global trend. And we have a lot of testimonies about such violence. So the monitoring, it's important because it goes beyond and it's systematic. It's based on evidence-based with facts. And we are worried about to bring in the project a spreadsheet with data showing our methodology, the methodology we use to build this report. So one of the goals is to align to see so the report can bring more general aspects in a safer way, and it brings inputs for a debate and to create actions to tackle such issues. So first, we like to say that we collect violence against women journalists, but we We are also worried about different expressions of gender violence. So we have cases about women, but also cases that use the gender aspect to attack someone regardless of the gender. So homophobia, transphobia, any other discrimination target to the sexual orientation was considered. And we also capture cases of outlets that were feminist outlets. It was the case of Mulheres da periferia, Jessica's outlet. So we have this broader approach of what is gender in our report. The methodology, you can check the methodology on the work, but one of the main challenges that we have in our study is to go beyond the sub-notification of cases, because some cases are not reported officially. So we have to diversify our collecting technique to bring a broader scenario. And we can say that cases here represent only a fraction of violence. Because, for example, we don't have in our report cases that are not public, cases that, and this is, unfortunately, it's something that happens routinely, but they happen in the private sphere and they are not in our report. So we can, maybe we can say that the cases are even higher, a lot higher than that, but we don't involve private cases. We recorded 119 cases, and 38% of them were labeled as gender attacks, attacking women, attack sexuality, using stereotypes to target the victim. And we had this, when we analyzed the words that were used to attack women, we built this cloud of words that shows the words that were more used, especially on the online environment. But we also have cases of physical violence, homophobic attacks, transphobic attacks. We have a difference when we check month by month, we have a difference, but we have an average of one attack each 3 days. And something that we notice in our survey is that in some occasions, attacks go beyond, and then they reach family, their relatives, they have doxing of family members, etc. Something that came to our attention is that cases of victims that work in some area, some department of the outlet were more specific. Women that work with politics were more attacked. 60% of the attacks are directed to women that work with politics. So this is the main topic related to attacks. Even when we had attacks related to healthcare and health issues during the pandemic, the issue was connected to politics. So even in the health attacks, so to speak, they were connected to politics. And it's also follow a global trend that show that women are more attacked when they are talking about politics or elections. So they have a motivation, they have a background of the type of the journalists that it work of government, transparency. So it is used as an instrument to influence such this type of journalist coverage. And we also have government actors as authors. We have some cases that we cannot identify properly, people that were not identified, anonymous attackers, but every time we could identify 52% were from governments. And when we have more than one aggressor, 69% were initiated by government actors and non-state actors that were connected to these state actors. And we identified the more prevalent actors in the year. And so the President Jair Bolsonaro leads the list, followed by Representative Carlos Jordi. And we have all the other perpetrators showing the strong connection and the aggression to state actors. 90% of the identifiable perpetrators were men. Another pattern that we could check on our data is the linking of perpetrators, of state actors and trolls networks. The way that we mapped the attacks showed that we probably have trolls networks connected to state actors. It starts from state officials and they go from massive launching of attacks. So we can see from this data that we have ways of attacking women that are orchestrated, carried out according to some methods. Stigmatizing discourse was the most prevalent way of attacking, but we also had physical attacks, threats, intimidation. And the last part that we would like to highlight is the presence of digital media. Although we also collect cases out of digital media, we see that they have an important role as an instrument on these attacks. I'm gonna finish here. Sorry about my watch, but we can highlight the importance of digital media, the importance of state actors as perpetrators and as producers of attacks, as a way to take out the credibility of a journalist using a moral attack. So to attack a moral of a woman is something that is used as a regular strategy to undermine the importance of journalism and journalists. So thank you, and that was my presentation. Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. I'm sorry that I disappeared. We had a storm here, and I had to been off and on again. And it's very important to understand how the survey was produced and the challenge that we have in Brazil, so we can understand the types of violence against women journalists. So we have a lot of challenges because women sometimes don't. Jéssica, está me ouvindo, Jéssica? Jéssica, can you hear me? So we have a lot of, she's having an audio issue and she's not checking it. So we can see on the project. So, and to have this connection and reflection, considering what violence we called Julie Posetti, who is the vice president of the International Center of Journalists and a feminist journalist, and the main author of a survey which had a very, it was disclosed in 2020. She worked for Reuters Institute. So the floor is yours, Julie, and welcome to our conversation.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? For once, we don't have a storm in the UK currently, which is unusual because we have had so many storms. And this is a conversation about storms. It's a conversation about what it's like to be at the core of a really violent storm. And that violence, when it comes to my expertise, is gender-based online violence. And so I'd be very glad to share with you some of the insights from our 2 going on 3-year-long study now for UNESCO, which is about to be published in full, hopefully on World Press Freedom Day, which is May 3. But from that study, we've already published 2 reports, and some speakers before me have mentioned the 2020 survey, which presented a global overview of world trends in online violence against women journalists, which is a shocking trend to have to, or series of trends to have to describe. But that survey really does reflect on a global level the kinds of evidence you're gathering on the ground in Brazil. One of the awful aspects of this research is that although there might be differences in terms of the way online violence against women journalists manifests itself from country to country, there are some things that remain the same. That is the role of political actors, including presidents and prime ministers, in instigating and amplifying online violence against women journalists. So in our survey, which included around 900 participants, 714 of whom were women journalists, we found that 73%, so nearly 3/4 rather, nearly 3 in 4 women journalists who responded to that survey from 140 plus countries said that they had experienced online violence in the course of their work, meaning that while they were working as journalists, so when they're using social media or other digital communications channels to report, to produce, to broadcast, and so on. And 37% of the women journalists said that they believed that the top perpetrators were in fact political actors. Another important and highly related statistic from that first survey is that 41% of the women journalists said that they'd experienced online violence in the form of orchestrated disinformation campaigns. So they sensed in the course of the attacks that they experienced that they'd been exposed not just to the use of disinformation to try to discredit them both personally and professionally, but also that they deduced, that they concluded that these attacks at the rate of 41% had been organized or orchestrated, which really does highlight, I think, effectively the role of disinformation in on targeted online violence against women journalists, which is something we need to understand at every level so that we can respond effectively. So what we found was that the women journalists being targeted in the context of disinformation, that there was like a threefold function. So there were 3 different ways that disinformation operated. One way was that women who were reporting on disinformation were attacked more substantially and frequently than other women. And that was because they were subject to responses to their reporting on disinformation from experienced disinformation producers. So the tactics of disinformation were then deployed against the women journalists. So that's the second function of disinformation, the use of disinformation tactics in misogynistic attacks against women. And the third manifestation of disinformation is really to be understood in terms of disinformation purveyors, so the creators and the producers of disinformation content, or those seeking to really undermine public trust in critical journalism, would use disinformation as a tactic. So we see the misogynists using disinformation to try to further discredit the women. We also see the disinformation agents using misogynistic hate speech to try to really undermine the women that they're targeting. And another really important statistic that I think is important to bear in mind from this survey is that 20% of the women who responded said they'd experienced offline abuse or harassment or attacks. So that is in the physical world, that they connected to the online violence they'd experienced. So they were drawing a line between online threats and attacks and offline harassment and abuse. It's difficult to know always whether that is a correlation, so whether it looks like there is a connection or if a direct line can be drawn. But what we found when we followed up this survey with 183 interviews that we did with women journalists and experts around the world, and Brazil was one of the countries that was focused on, and we were assisted with a large number of international researchers and research assistants to do this. But through those interviews, we heard some pretty horrific stories, not just in Brazil and not just in countries that we knew from historical analysis were likely to be places where there was significant pre-existing violence against women journalists, but all around the world. So we found stories in Northern Ireland, for example, of a woman who is now a freelance journalist, but who was writing for one of the big newspapers in Northern Ireland, writing about crime, corruption, paramilitary outfits. And she had experienced some really violent online threats against her and against her family, including her baby. And those threats were credible and the police were investigating. So there was a direct link between the online threats at scale, which she experienced according to the police, and the likelihood of physical danger. She also had her name and various content that had been created to harass her on Twitter, for example, spray painted on a wall in Belfast. So this is a very kind of physical manifestation of the threats that she was receiving online. That's just one example. Another example that I'll share with you from current research that we're doing, which follows on from the UNESCO study, which is designed to try to develop what we're calling an early warning system, so that we can try at a global level to understand where are the triggers, at what point do we see signals that should warn us that online violence is escalating in a way that it could become an offline attack, or that online violence is surging in such a way that it is particularly damaging. So psychological trauma, for example, could be extreme. And one of the case studies associated with that study is the Indian journalist Rana Ayub, who writes for the Washington Post. But she really does, it's an emblematic case. She demonstrates very clearly, or at least her experience of online violence demonstrates very clearly that she is attacked because she is a woman. She is attacked because she is a journalist writing critical reports about the Modi government. And she is attacked because she's Muslim. So she very much experiences intersectional online violence. So she's targeted for all of these reasons. Racism is also an additional layer of discrimination that she experiences. And so today for International Women's Day, we released some data based on what we're calling a big data case studies. So with two amazing women colleagues from the University of Sheffield, Professor Kalina Boncheva and Dr. Diana Maynard, who are computer scientists. My team at the International Centre for Journalists and colleagues working in the field have analysed 8.5 million tweets directed at Rana. And today we launched the first findings from that analysis. We found that nearly 30% of the abuse that Rana receives, when that abuse is targeting her at a misogynistic level, using a very terrible term, which I know is also used in Brazil, and that term is prostitute. So the idea of combining the word prostitute with the press to really threaten and intimidate and demoralize a woman journalist and expose her to ridicule at the personal level and the professional level. So in Rana's case, where the term prostitute is used in abusive tweets against her, and we know that prostitute is just like a byword for really vile misogynistic abuse, where that term is used, 30% of the tweets feature forms of other abuse that really can be understood as religious bigotry. So words like jihad, hijab, terrorist, these words will be used in combination with prostitute. So we see the really vile ways that these forms of discrimination intersect to both deepen the pain and increase the risk that women journalists face online. We did two other big data case studies as part of the UNESCO study. One was about Maria Ressa, who is, of course, a Nobel laureate now. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in December. And one of the reasons she was recognized was because of her incredibly bold and brave fight, but not just against oppression, not just against media freedom threats and journalism safety threats broadly, but for her individual stance and speaking back to her attackers as somebody who experienced extremely threatening online violence. And in Maria's case, when we analysed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tweets and Facebook posts with the same colleagues, we found evidence, clear evidence of an enabling environment existing online for the persecution, prosecution, and eventual conviction of Maria on trumped up charges in the Philippines. So, we're gathering evidence now that shows us that while the murder with impunity of women journalists, if we're talking specifically about women journalists, is still, of course, the most horrific way to silence a journalist, we're starting to see the ways in which online violence really does create this enabling environment for the kinds of attacks that can escalate all the way to that most final and horrific outcome for women. So what we have found, as I say, is this global pattern, which you have now illustrated at a level in Brazil, which very much chimes with what we've found. And I think what we need now is more efforts like this in countries around the world, where people on the ground can really do a deep study based on, in partnership, very important that you've partnered with Abraji and that you're involving journalists, because this is the way to get action. We must actually, I think, study these things with a mind to change the circumstances, to improve the circumstances for women journalists. So congratulations. It's shocking, but the first step is recognizing that it exists and then providing the evidence so that when frequently male critics of this kind of work and women's discussion of these experiences online, we're able to present those critics with evidence and to say, this is not just a series of feelings. This is hard, evidence-based abuse that is being directed at women. And here are the very legitimate, very serious impacts that must be addressed locally, internationally, all the way through to the halls of the UN. So again, congratulations and thank you for having me, and look forward to having a bit more of a chat.
Thank you, Julie. I was offline while I was presenting you because I was on the wrong channel. So I apologize. I had the storm here in my neighborhood. So thank you, Julie. Thank you, Veronica, for your explanation. It's very important to have this connection to understand globally how gender violence is happening. So Veronica mentioned that Nós, Mulheres da Periferia has also suffered a hacker attack. So we have been living different levels of attack, as Julie mentioned too, from other places. And such violence, they can be physical, but they are also mental. They affect us, and how can we take care of our mental health after that? And to talk about such attacks, we'll have now Mariliz Pereira Jorge. Welcome, Mariliz. She's a journalist, she's a screenwriter, she's a columnist of Folha de S.Paulo. She writes about gender, politics, sports, and she was a reporter and editor of magazines. She's also a host of My News and Global, and she was part of TV shows. So thank you for your presence, Mariliz, and the floor is yours. I'd like to thank you all and congratulate you all, my colleagues that brought their words here on their areas, Julie, Veronica, Jéssica, Marlova. You all brought a lot of data that show how a life of a journalist is today. So we see all surveys in Brazil and out of here, we have a very similar scenario. So one topic that Julia brought, which is the risk that all of us have of the online violence becoming a physical, real world violence. In the election year, it's one of the main concerns that all of us have. My cat is meowing here, so working from home has this sort of issues. I've been writing as a columnist at Folha de S.Paulo for 8 years after working as a reporter and an editor, and it's terrifying, as Veronica mentioned, it's terrifying that the attacks are more focused on women covering politics. Because for 3.5 years, I wrote for the sports session. So I talked about football and everything connected to football. So corruption, homophobia, misogynistic attacks. And at the time, it was the World Cup time, the Olympics time, and I've never felt the violence that I'm feeling from that I have felt from 3 years on when I started writing more about politics. Violence is always present, yes, but we didn't used to mention attacks. We used to say, well, someone scared me or told me off something, but the way that they were being attacked, we journalists being attacked, it's something that is more prevalent and evident from 2018. Before the last presidential elections, this violent climate on social media that that, by the way, was decisive to our elections, the 2018 elections. Social media had a greater role, even greater than TV shows during the elections. And in 2018, it was the first time that I was attacked. At first, it was hard because I spent 3 days without checking social media, without talking to each other. I was scared. And I had a mental impact that was huge. And things got very worse from that day on. So it doesn't surprise me with the level of the attacks, but it's something that you never get used to it. No one can get used to violence, especially violence that are directed to women, because we are a very easy target. And the study that you have shown, it's something that we are feeling. Women are attacked because of due to their gender, their sexuality, their age, their physical appearance, their sexual orientation, and it's very different. Men have a different situation. Other data that Veronica and Julia brought is they show that this is something that happened, and also out of Brazil, is the origin of attacks. So state actors are the orchestrators of such attacks, and they started to be more organized from some years on. So it's not something organic. A reader that is not happy with the newspaper, or someone on social media, it's such attacks, they came like a tsunami, and they drown you because they are orchestrated. They have some nuclei that produce material, that produce the posts to be used for the groups of 20,000, 30,000 people on Telegram. For specifically, these hate groups are attacking journalists. I was taking notes of some things. Other thing that I feel, it's lack of support from the networks, from the social media networks, because they allow nearly everything. I denounced hundreds of attacks, of posts, and not a single time I had a positive answer that that post or that person, that profile was being taken down due to their behavior. Even the journalists sometimes are punished, and their profiles are sometimes take down because of the attacks, because they denounce us, our profiles, and they can do that, and they can silence our voice by doing that. In 2022, I think it's going to be a lot harder. We'll have an even more violent year due to the elections, because of a lack of more objective bills to make the platforms, to make the social media platforms responsible, accountable for these attacks. In the US, the profile of the former president Donald Trump was took down of the Twitter after the elections, after he damaged the whole process. So the behavior here of the President Bolsonaro and representatives and supporters that support Bolsonaro and his government, they have the same behavior that we saw in the US. We don't want this happening in Brazil. We don't want a capital invasion or something like that. But maybe we'll have exactly the same scenario that depending on the results of the election, we will have a civil confrontation in the country that can lead to death, that can lead to persecution of journalists, and etc. And to wrap up, I've been trying to protect myself mentally because of the attacks. I've been in all lists, all surveys regarding violence against women journalists. And I always say that this is the sort of list that I wouldn't like to be part of. And I see colleagues that are friends, and I feel their suffering. I know that we work a lot. We know that we work a lot. Working from home, it made us work even more. And we have to deal with our mental health, which is daily attacked and suffocated by such attacks. And I can say that we will keep on working, and they want to silence us. They want to make us afraid. They want to make us quit as journalists. But I can say that they will not succeed. And this is making us stronger as a class, as women journalists. So this March 8th, which is always a celebrative date, it's been in the last years. The symbol has been changing in the last years for something more of a challenge. That the challenge that we have and the discussions that we have to discuss the freedom of the press and to cherish the space of women have conquered in journalists. I would like to thank you all that are part of this panel, and also my colleagues here that are discussing. We are together. We'll go together. Thank you, Mariliz. I think you have important points such as mental health of women journalists and things that we have to be aware of. Some of the questions that we have from the audience are linked to this topic. Do you think that it's important to have psychological support and legal support for women journalists? And I would like to have to add other questions, and then we can have to a discussion before we wrap up. Another question is, do you think, Maria has asked, machismo and bigotry in Brazil, in Latin America, and racism in Brazil, how they are reflected in Brazil, in the work of Brazilian journalists. We know that 80% of women attacked in Brazil are white, but it's also something that reflects the media in Brazil that has mostly white professionals. Is it right that platforms to take their money from content that are shared, that are massively shared? What do you think of these platforms, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, what they could do to avoid coordinated attacks? Which protocols should they have to avoid them? And beyond these questions, we know there are a lot of challenges, but what are the paths from the diagnosis that you found? Women journalists that are watching us, which paths they can follow from now on? So I'll give the floor to you so you can debate all these questions. I would like to start And about the psychological support or legal support when they are attacked. It's crucial. March last year, I suffered one of the worst attacks that I had. And fortunately, I had all the support from the newspaper Folha de S.Paulo. They supported me legally and sent me all the guidelines of how should I behave at home. They suggested me to leave my house in Rio de Janeiro for some days. So they also provide me financial support so I could leave my house for some days. It's crucial that we are connected to companies, to enterprises and groups of people. So we can have legal support from groups to have the support to journalists that are being attacked. So I would say again, it's crucial that we have this. I felt more supported and less vulnerable at that time because I had the support. It would be much more difficult. And unfortunately, not all journalists can count with the support. Thank you. Veronica would like to answer some of the questions. Okay. I will try to answer a more technical question that we have about the report about racism, structural racism and bigotry. We had few cases collected involving Black women or Black people as a whole. It's especially because of the racial profile of the journalism careers. The news desks are full of more white people than Black people. So we have cases of racial slur. So we can see the simultaneous action of bigotry and racism used to take out the credibility of a journalist. And one of the insights of the international literature about it is that bigotry and racism are used as an instrument. So because they made us not to lead with the content of that we're reporting, but the attack itself. And some of the terms that were used to Black journalists were very racist, and they attack the cognitive ability of them. It's something that's in the report. And I think that during the follow-up and the monitoring, continuous monitoring, we can have more. They also ask about women representatives who attack journalists if they use the same words as men, as male representatives, because we have conservative representatives attacking journalists too, women representatives. We have few cases. It's difficult to separate as data, but the same terms that we identified by male representatives were used in some of the attacks of female representatives. What our survey identifies is some of those actors that we recognized were male, but it's not that we don't have women in the attack, especially when you have a launching of massive attacks. So this is something that we'd like to I think that's what I have to answer.
Can I also,
thank you.
Sorry, can I offer some comments in reference to those questions too? Just on the point of psychological trauma, it is so very important to have a hybrid approach when you're dealing with attacks, particularly large-scale attacks, particularly attacks that involve threats of sexual or physical violence, or attacks that are designed to expose you to other forms of hate. And that does require psychological support. It requires social support in the form of solidarity and from colleagues, but also from civil society networks. Absolutely essential is digital safety and security training. So, because as you've heard, these attacks do not just involve threats and abusive terms, they also involve, everything from doxing through to DDoS attacks on the outlets that are publishing the work by the women journalists. So there has to be this integrated approach, along with physical security, which we're quite used to dealing with, right? After decades of knowledge sharing around protecting women journalists physically in the field, particularly in the context of threats from organized crime or in conflict zones. But this now needs to be integrated. Some international news organizations, some larger news organizations within individual countries are now better equipped. There's better understanding. There's more solidarity across different news organizations, for example, to share good practices. There's a particularly good example in Canada where all of the competing news organizations have come together to try to work on this problem and actually share resources, particularly also with the freelance community. Because, those of us who've worked both as a freelancer and as a journalist in a large media organization, which is me, I've had both experiences. And I came under attack once, not online, but from a really horrendous partisan news organization. When I was just left journalism and become an academic, I felt so alone, so exposed, because I was not part of my newsroom anymore, and I didn't have that support. So I always think about that when I'm talking to or dealing with freelance journalists or journalists from really small startups, where they're dispersed because the pandemic has us all sitting, at our computers, at our screens. So this integrated approach with solidarity, with the psychological support, economic support too. I think one of you mentioned this, you do need help financially, potentially, to move you and your children, say, to a hotel or to another safe place when the threats do become significant. And we've seen examples of that working. We've also seen examples of news organizations moving a journalist for a few nights and then saying, well, the threat's still there, but you're going to have to pay for the rest of the accommodation yourself, which is particularly hard for women journalists who, generally speaking, earn less than their male counterpart. And so this is very important. I think the other thing that was mentioned is the role of the platforms. And you'll see from the extract from the UNESCO study that was published in May last year called The Chilling, we made very clear recommendations that the platforms needed to do much more quickly, spend much more money, and provide services in each of the countries where they operate, in the languages in which they operate, with the support of gender sensitive employees who also understand threats to journalists. So journalism safety expertise, press freedom expertise. I mean, while we were still researching as that extract from the study was published, Facebook finally decided that it was probably no longer appropriate to allow people to threaten to rape women journalists on the platform. Previously, it had been considered to be fine, and the justification was that women journalists are public figures. There was this fundamental failure to understand international human rights obligations, at the UN level or even just human level. And, as we kind of recommended those sorts of services, the points for escalation of complaints to a human moderator for quick action when a journalist is being threatened, particularly at scale, is really important. And they're starting, they're just starting to use the right language. But unfortunately, particularly for Facebook, that language is still much more aligned with public relations instead of the language of action. So a lot to digest there, but yes, solidarity anyway at a global level for what you're enduring locally.
Thank you, Julie. So solidarity is the word. And I think solidarity among different sectors. So we have to consider solutions as an intersectional approach. We have to we don't have a single answer, but we have to see how to use education, culture, all instruments that we have. And before we wrap up, I would like to call Marlova for her final words. She started mentioning a broader scenario of the pandemic. Marlova, what do you think are the paths that we have forward in a more positive way? I know that the scenario is very complex, especially for us Black women from the outskirts, from the impoverished areas. First, I would like to thank you all, Veronica, Julie, and Mariliz, for their words, because I think that it was a moment of a lot of learning. And I learned a lot by hearing them. And so we can understand the size of the problem and the survey that was and the work of the International Center that Julie conducts in London, the experience of Mariliz, the way that she shared the difference between being a journalist writing about sports and about politics, the contests. See that they all suffered some sort of aggression, online, offline. I think Julie says very importantly the importance of knowing about cybersecurity so we can have tools to protect ourselves. And I'd like to highlight the work of UNESCO in this to train, to provide advocacy and awareness, which is raise awareness for so they can be they know the risks. But I would also like to, Jessica, by listening to you and the way that I'd like to finish with a word of hope. I'm an optimist, and I think that for every and each act of violence, there's a mechanism of resistance. We women are resilient. Part of our beauty is in our strength. It's a strength that that made us generate lives. So the strength of women and the way that we showed in our daily lives the strength, the resilience, the courage made us take us to a scenario, a better scenario than that we have years ago. Today, we can present a report, have resource to do it, to conduct an investigation, and have the work of the International Center to connecting the whole world, sharing its findings, its research. So I believe that with information, with sharing of ideas and resilience and resistance, we can change the scenario. When they where they want to shut us, to shut our mouths, we are resilience, we are strength, and we are voice. So I think this is my final words. Let us be resistance, potency, and resiliency. and more surveys and studies like this come in the future. Thank you, Christina, the Abraji's director, celebrating acknowledging the work of Abraji, and we are very happy with this partnership. And let's move on, resilient and strong. Thank you, Marlova. Thank you again, Verônica, Mariliz, Julie, Abraji, UNESCO. We have a very important data for the journalism in Brazil, and also the gender issues, the race. So it's very important that we have data, because sometimes we have to reaffirm who we are, and data, it's very important, so we can have science on our side. I'd like to invite you all to the full survey in our website, so we can check out our website. You can share and take these discussions to schools, universities, and have this survey be shared. Sorry about being out for some minutes, and I'd like to thank you, and I hope that we are in contact, strong and resilient, with hope in the future, because this is important, so you can being journalists. Thank you all.
Thank you.